In the spring of 1987, Margaret Hale stood in the middle of a 40-acre plot of land that nobody else wanted. The soil was thin. The wind cut through the valley like it had something to prove. And every single person in Millbrook County told her the same thing. She was throwing her life away. Margaret was 34 years old. She had $217 in her savings account. She had a second-hand tractor that leaked oil and a barn with a roof that sagged like a tired old horse. She had a daughter named Ruth, who was 12 years old, and asked every night why they couldn't just move to town like normal people. And she had a plan that made absolutely no sense to anyone who heard it. She was going to plant her entire field in circles, not rows, not the straight, orderly lines that every farmer in the county had used for generations. Circles, concentric rings of corn, wheat, and beans, spiraling outward from a single point in the center of her land. In the center of her land, like the rings of a tree trunk. Her neighbor, old Frank Coulter, laughed so hard he had to lean against his fence post. He told her she'd been reading too many books. He told her crops don't grow in circles. He told her the only thing circular farming produced was bankruptcy. He said it right to her face, standing there in his overalls with tobacco juice staining his chin, and he didn't even try to hide the grin. The county extension agent, a man named Harold Vance, who wore the same brown suit to every meeting, shook his head and said she was violating every principle of modern agriculture. He handed her a pamphlet on contour plowing and told her to come back when she was ready to farm like a rational person. He wrote something in his leather notebook while she stood there, and she knew it wasn't a compliment. Even her own mother, who had never set foot on a farm in her life, called from 2 states away to ask if Margaret had lost her mind. The voice on the phone was tight with worry, the kind of worry that comes from watching your daughter make what looks like a terrible mistake. Everyone agreed on one thing. Margaret Hale was going to fail, and she was going to fail spectacularly. But here's what nobody understood. Margaret hadn't chosen circles because she was eccentric. She hadn't chosen circles because she wanted attention. She had chosen circles because she had spent 3 years watching the land, and the land had been trying her something, had been trying to tell her something that nobody else was listening to. It started with the dust. Millbrook County sat in a valley that collected wind like a bowl. Every spring, the winds came roaring down from the north, carrying topsoil from the surrounding hills and depositing it in strange patterns across the fields. Margaret had noticed something that the other farmers dismissed as coincidence. The dust never settled in straight lines. It always formed curves, gentle arcs that followed the contour of the land. She had spent her first 2 years on the farm fighting that pattern. She had plowed straight rows, just like everyone else, and every spring, the wind had carved those rows into channels, stripping the soil from the high points and burying the low points in drifts of dust. Her yields had been mediocre at best. Her soil had been getting thinner every year. And then, one afternoon in her 3rd year, she had stood on her porch during a dust storm and watched the wind trace a perfect spiral across her empty field. The dust moved in a circle, spiraling inward toward a low point in the center, where an old oak tree had once stood. The tree was gone, cut down by the previous owner decades ago. But the pattern remained. Margaret realized something that day. The land had a memory, and that memory was circular. She spent the next 6 months researching. She read everything she could find on indigenous farming practices, on permaculture, on the way natural systems organized themselves. She discovered that in many traditional agricultural societies, circular planting wasn't just symbolic. It was practical. It mimicked the way water moved across the land. It created microclimates that protected crops from wind damage. It concentrated nutrients in patterns that plants had evolved to follow. She found a book in the university library, tucked away, in a section nobody visited, about farming methods used by indigenous communities in the Southwest. They had planted in circles for thousands of years, not because they were primitive, because they had observed the same patterns Margaret had seen in her own field. They had learned that circles held water better than rows. They had learned that circles broke the wind. They had learned that circles created communities of plants that supported each other in ways that rows never could. But nobody in Millbrook County cared about traditional practices. They cared about yield per acre. They cared about efficiency. They cared about looking like every other farm in the county. They cared about fitting in. Margaret didn't care about fitting in. She had never fit in. She had grown up in a family that moved every 2 years, following her father's job from one city to another. She had gone to 3 different high schools. She had learned early that fitting in was a luxury she couldn't afford. She had learned to trust her own observations, her own instincts, her own understanding of the world. She didn't care about looking like anyone else. She cared about making the land work, and she was willing to bet everything she had on the idea that the land knew more about farming than the county extension agent did. So, in the spring of 1987, she marked out her circles. She started with a single point in the center of her field, the spot where the old oak tree had once stood. She drove a steel stake into the ground and tied a rope to it. Then, she walked outward in a spiral, marking the boundaries of her planting rings with lime. The circles were 15 feet wide at the center and grew to 40 feet at the outer edge. She planted corn in the inner rings, where the soil was deepest and the wind was weakest. She planted wheat in the middle rings, where the stalks could catch the wind without breaking. And she planted beans in the outer rings, where the nitrogen they added to the soil would feed the entire system. It took her 3 weeks to plant the field. 3 weeks of walking in circles, dropping seeds by hand, while her neighbors drove past on the county road and slowed down to stare. She could see them shaking their heads. She could see them laughing. She could see them making bets on how long it would take her to give up. At night, after Ruth had gone to bed, Margaret would sit on the porch and look out at the circles in the moonlight. She would wonder if she was wrong. She would wonder if Frank Coulter was right. She would wonder if she had just doomed her daughter to a life of poverty and ridicule. But then she would look at the way the moonlight fell on the curved rows, and she would see the pattern again, the spiral, the memory. And she would know that she was doing what the land asked. Ruth helped her on the weekends. The 12-year-old girl walked the circles with her mother, dropping seeds into the furrows, her small hands working with a precision that surprised Margaret. Ruth didn't ask why they were planting in circles anymore. She had stopped asking after the first week. She just worked, silent and steady, and Margaret was grateful for that silence. Frank Coulter told everyone at the feed store that Margaret had finally snapped. He said she was going to lose her farm by fall. He said the bank would take the land and sell it to someone who knew how to farm properly. He said it was a shame, because she had been a decent farmer before she got strange ideas. He said it loud enough for everyone to hear, and he made sure to say it every time he went to town. Harold Vance, the extension agent, wrote a note in his file about Margaret's unconventional methods. He predicted a total crop failure and recommended that the bank monitor her loan carefully. He told his supervisor that Margaret Hale was a cautionary tale about what happened when farmers stopped listening to science. He used words like delusional and irresponsible and financially reckless. He didn't know that Margaret had friends at the bank who told her what he had written. Margaret heard all of it. She heard the laughter. She heard the predictions. She heard the pity in people's voices when they talked about her at the grocery store. She heard the whispers behind her, back at the church, potluck. She heard Frank Coulter's voice in her head every time she walked her circles, and she kept planting because she had seen something they hadn't. She had seen the way the circles held water after a rain. She had seen the way the wind flowed around the curves instead of cutting through straight lines. She had seen the way the different crops supported each other, the corn providing shade for the beans fixing nitrogen for the wheat breaking the wind for the corn. She had seen a system, and systems don't care about laughter. By midsummer, the difference was already visible. While the other farmers' fields were showing the stress of the hot, dry weather that had settled over the county, Margaret's circles were green and thriving. The corn in the center rings was knee-high and dark green, protected from the wind by the outer rings of wheat. The beans were climbing the corn stalks, just as she had hoped. The wheat was bending in the wind but not breaking, its roots deep in the soil that the circles had held in place. Frank Coulter drove past one morning and stopped his truck. He got out and stood at the fence line, staring at Margaret's field. He didn't say anything. He just stood there for 10 minutes, looking at the circles of green in the middle of a landscape that was turning brown. Then he got back in his truck and drove away without a word. Ruth saw him from the barn window. She told her mother that night, over dinner, that Mr. Coulter had looked like he had seen a ghost. Margaret didn't say anything. She just smiled and passed the potatoes. But it wasn't until the drought hit that everything changed. The drought of 1987 wasn't supposed to happen. The weather forecasters had predicted a normal summer. The farmers had planted their crops with confidence. And then, in late July, the rain stopped. It didn't just stop for a week. It stopped for 6 weeks. The temperature climbed into the hundreds and stayed there. The rivers dropped, the wells ran low, and the crops started to die. It happened fast. 1 week, the fields were green. The next week, they were yellow. The week after that, they were brown. The corn in the straight row fields curled its leaves and dropped its ears. The wheat turned brittle and broke in the wind. The beans dried up and crumbled into dust. The farmers watched it happen with a kind of helpless horror. They had insurance, but insurance didn't cover the kind of loss they were looking at. They had loans to pay. They had families to feed. And they had fields that were turning into dust before their eyes. Some of them stood in their fields and cried. Some of them sat on their porches and stared at the brown earth in silence. Some of them started making calls to the bank, knowing what was coming. The drought didn't just take their crops. It took their hope. Margaret watched it too. She watched her neighbors' fields die while her circles held on. It wasn't magic. It was design. The circular pattern created a system of microclimates that buffered the crops from the worst of the drought. The inner rings of corn, protected by the outer rings, lost less moisture to evaporation. The beans, with their deep roots, pulled water from deeper in the soil than the shallow-rooted crops in the straight rows. The wheat, bent but not broken, created a living mulch that kept the ground cool. And then there was the well. Margaret had dug her well in the center of the circles, right where the old oak tree had once stood. She hadn't known why at the time. She had just followed the pattern. But as the drought deepened, she realized that the circular planting had created a natural drainage system that concentrated groundwater in the center of the field. The well, which had been marginal in her first years, now produced water when every other well in the county was running dry. She watered her crops by hand, carrying buckets from the well to the circles that needed it most. It was back-breaking work. She was up at 4 in the morning and still working at 10 at night. Her hands blistered, her back ached, her shoulders burned with the weight of the buckets. But her crops lived. Ruth helped her, the 12-year-old girl who had once asked why they couldn't move to town, now carried buckets alongside her mother. Without complaint, she didn't ask about moving anymore. She had seen what the circles could do. She had seen the green in the middle of the brown. She had seen the way her mother's crazy idea was becoming something real. By August, the difference was stark. The straight row fields were brown and lifeless. The circles were still green, still growing, still producing. The corn had ears. The wheat had heads. The beans had pods. Frank Coulter came to her door one evening. He didn't laugh this time. He asked if she could walk her field. He asked if she would explain the circles. He asked if she would help him replant his own land the following spring. He stood on her porch with his hat in his hands, and he looked like a man who had just realized he had been wrong about everything. Harold Vance, the extension agent, came next. He brought a camera and a notebook. He took measurements and soil samples. He asked Margaret to speak at the county agricultural meeting. He told his supervisor that Margaret Hale had discovered something that the extension office needed to study. He didn't mention the note he had written, calling her delusional. He didn't mention the predictions of failure. He just asked questions and took notes and tried to understand what he had dismissed. The bank, which had been monitoring Margaret's loan, sent a letter saying her credit line had been extended. They didn't mention the file that Harold Vance had started. They didn't mention the predictions of failure. They just said they were pleased with her progress and looked forward to her continued success. Margaret kept the letter in the same drawer where she kept the extension agent's pamphlet. She liked the symmetry of it. By harvest time, Margaret's yields were the highest in the county. Not just the highest for a farmer using unconventional methods. The highest, period. Her corn produced 40% more bushels per acre than the county average. Her wheat was the best quality the local elevator had seen in years. Her beans were so plentiful that she had to rent additional storage space. The other farmers, the ones who had laughed and predicted her failure, now came to her for advice. They stood in her circles and asked questions. They took notes. They went home and started planning their own changes for the following spring. But Margaret wasn't satisfied. She knew that the circles were just the beginning. She knew that the land had more to teach her. And she knew that the drought of 1987 wasn't the last one. She spent the winter studying. She read about water conservation. She read about soil biology. She read about the way forests manage themselves without human intervention. She read about mycorrhizal networks, the underground systems of fungi that connected plants and allowed them to share nutrients and water. She read about companion planting, about polycultures, about the way nature never grew just one thing in one place. And she started to see a bigger picture. The circles weren't just a farming technique. They were a way of thinking, a way of working with the land instead of against it, a way of seeing patterns instead of imposing them, a way of understanding that the land was not a machine to be optimized, but a living system to be partnered with. The following spring, she expanded the system. She added more circles, each one designed for a different crop combination. She planted fruit trees in the spaces between the circles, creating a food forest that would eventually produce its own harvest. She added a pond in the lowest part of the land, using the circular drainage pattern to collect rainwater that would have otherwise run off. She built a composting system that turned her farm waste into rich soil amendment. She started keeping bees, placing hives at the edges of the circles where the flowers would feed them and they would pollinate her crops. She added chickens, letting them free range between the circles where they would eat insects and fertilize the soil with their manure. And she started teaching. Other farmers came to learn. At first, it was just the neighbors who had seen her success. Then it was farmers from other counties. Then it was agricultural students from the state university. Margaret turned her barn into a classroom and spent every Saturday morning teaching what she had learned. She didn't charge for the classes. She didn't write a book. She didn't patent her methods. She just shared what she knew because she believed that the knowledge belonged to the land, not to her. She believed that if the land had taught her, she had a responsibility to teach others. By 1990, 3 years after she had planted her first circles, Margaret's farm had become a model for sustainable agriculture in the region. The state university sent researchers to study her methods. The Department of Agriculture gave her a grant to expand her work, and farmers from across the country came to see what she had built. Ruth grew up in those circles. She learned to farm from her mother, learned to see the land as a partner rather than a resource to be exploited. She went to college and studied agriculture, then came back to the farm with new ideas and new energy. She and Margaret worked together, mother and daughter, expanding the system, refining the methods, teaching the next generation. But the real test came in 1992. That year, the drought was worse than 1987, much worse. The entire region was declared a disaster area. Crops failed across 3 states. Farmers lost their land. Food prices spiked, and the government sent emergency aid to communities that were facing famine. Margaret's farm didn't fail. In fact, it produced more in 1992 than it had in any previous year. The circles, now refined and expanded, created a resilient system that could handle extreme stress. The food forest was mature enough to produce fruit even in dry conditions. The pond provided irrigation when the wells failed. The bees pollinated the crops, even when other farms had no flowers. The chickens kept the insect populations down. And the diversity of crops meant that even if one failed, others would survive. Margaret didn't just feed her own family. She fed her neighbors. She donated truckloads of produce to food banks. She taught emergency workshops on drought-resistant farming to farmers who had lost everything. She shared her seeds, her knowledge, her time. And she proved that the old ways of farming, the ways that worked with the land instead of against it, were not just nostalgic. They were necessary. Frank Coulter, who had been one of her first students, now had his own circles. He had the highest yields in his township. He told anyone who would listen that Margaret Hale had saved his farm. He told the story of standing at her fence line, watching her green field in the middle of the brown, and realizing that everything he thought he knew about farming was wrong. Harold Vance, the extension agent, who had once dismissed her as a cautionary,